Good morning and welcome to the first meeting in 2014 of the Health and Sport Committee. And although it is January the 14th, best wishes to everyone for the new year. Firstly, I have apologies from Richard Lyle, who has been substituted today by Dennis Robertson. Welcome, Dennis. And Richard Simpson, who has been substituted by Malcolm Chisholm. Welcome again, Malcolm. We also have an apology for Gil Patterson, who's going to try and be with us later in the committee meeting. As usual at this point, I would ask everyone in the room to make sure that the mobile phones and Blackberries and stuff are switched off. We don't want to interfere with the sound system or indeed our proceedings this morning. Although I need to also point out that some of us are using tablets and iPads, etc., instead of hard copies of our papers, and we refer to them. Of course, the first item on the agenda today is our roundtable session to help us assess progress since our inquiry into support for community sport. Some of you may recall that about a year ago this week we launched the report at the Royal Mile Primary School next door to the Parliament. So we are a year on in ongoing work in this area. At this point, Morag was asking why she was sitting there, and she will start us off, because at this point we usually ask people to introduce themselves at the round table panel. Morag.
Thank you. My name is Morag Arnott. I'm the Executive Director of Winning Scotland Foundation.
Bob Doris, MSP for Glasgow and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Christine Scullion, Head of Development at the Robertson Trust.
Malcolm Chisholm, MSP for Edinburgh Northern and Leith.
Scott Cuthbertson, I'm Community Development Coordinator for the Equality Network.
Good morning, Dennis Robertson, MSP for Aberdeenshire West.
Gavin MacLeod, Chief Executive Officer with Scottish Disability Sport.
Colin Keir, MSP. I'm the MSP for Edinburgh Western.
Good morning, my name is Stuart Uni. I'm here representing Vocal, Voice of Culture and Leisure.
Good morning, John Howie, Programme Manager for Physical Activity at NHS Health Scotland.
Charlie Rayburn. I'm actually not representing anybody except myself, described as an independent advisor.
Rhoda Grant, Highlands and Islands MSP.
Morning, George Thompson. I'm Chief Executive of Volunteer Scotland.
Aileen MacLeod, MSP for the South of Scotland.
Good morning, Nigel Hall, Chief Executive of Scottish Athletics.
Nanette Milne, MSP for North East Scotland.
And of the Health and Sport Committee. Oh, Jill, Kim, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I've seen all these officials here.
I obviously look more official than I realised, so I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Kim Atkinson, Policy Director at the Scottish Sports Association.
Yes, you're such a familiar place around here. I thought I'm sorry about that. My apologies. Just eager to get on. Duncan McNeill, MSP for Greater Inverclyde, Convener of the Health and Sport Committee. Rhoda, I think you're going to kick us off, please, and then hopefully we can get a bit of a discussion going with the participants here.
Just to, I think, start us off, I think we all know the importance of taking more exercise and kind of the health messages attached to that. Can I ask how people feel that community sport actually plays into that agenda and helps people take more exercise and thereby live healthier lives?
Take that one. Nigel.
Very happy to jump in. I suppose the key for me is that communities. I'd probably come at this from a perspective of sports clubs and sports clubs being right at the heart of the community, and strong clubs providing those opportunities very locally and in a way and in a manner that suits their local community, albeit with the support of the local authority, trusts, governing bodies of sport, whoever it may be. But actually, to me, one of the key drivers to achieving greater levels of participation in sport and physical activity is about making sure that our sports clubs across the country in all of our sports are very accessible, are grounded in the community, have got the right support, and they are, what's the expression I'm looking for? Community enabled and embodied, I suppose, right in the heart of the community. They link with the local schools, they link with the local community activities, whether it be community sports hubs or trusts or school facilities, whatever it is. But they are very, very localised, and they're providing a very obvious pathway for young people, for older people of any age, into those sports. Because once they're there, they're in a sport, they're in a kind of community where they can stay involved in sport for life, arguably.
Anyone else? I see Charlie, I see George, and then Charlie.
I wonder, I don't know if it's helpful to think about in terms of community in sport alongside sport in community, and whether or not that's a distinction that could help to look at different ways in which we could approach this. In my own experience, thinking about Stirling Rugby Club, who have got a bit of experience about, it's very clearly community in sport. That thrives on a whole series of relationships and engagements that sees itself through in the activity, but is based upon a community perspective. Now, looking at some other sports that operate within the community who don't have that same degree of participation and relationships, I don't think they thrive the same. So I wonder whether or not we've got to come to grips to some extent with what do we mean by community, and can we genuinely find a way in which we embrace a much wider group of people into the life of a sport.
Charlie, and then Kim.
Okay, briefly, I think that physical activity is a very big agenda, and you're asking where does sport fit in. It has the potential to fit in, and I'm not always convinced we play a huge role in the big challenge of everybody being physically active as much as they have to be, because there's now, this recognition you have to be a little bit more intense with your exercise than was recognised. On the other hand, the potential, the biggest, as some of you who've been here before, when I've been speaking, I talk about Denmark a lot, just come back again from there. The biggest growth in participation in sport over there is people of my age, the old fogies. And their interest in sport, as well as physical activity and walking groups and so on, is huge. Sometimes one of the speakers talked about the adolescence of today. And then, just as we're talking about in athletics, if you learn as kids, I go swimming every day, but at one time I used to swim competitively, and I now use the knowledge I learned to swim every day. And people say, how do you do a tumble turn, and you help other people. And then I go on walks on the hills on a Sunday up in the Pentlands, and, that came from being taken on organised groups when I was younger in a semi-sporting agenda. But I would put, as I did when I was giving evidence first time, would point out that I don't think the main rationale for community sport is necessarily the physical activity one. It's one of the essential ingredients, but it then depends on how much you emphasise. For example, in the football clubs I used to deal with in West Lothian, I used to say, why don't you dads play football yourselves? In the summer, 7-a-side pitches we've got now, instead of just watching and shouting at their own kids sort of thing. So it has the potential.
Rhoda's, early question, but Charlie's raised some others. So if you can take it on, that would be great.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's a very fair question, and I think it's something that there are lots of different angles to, which I think is important. There are 13,000 sports clubs in Scotland, and there are a fifth of the population are members of a club. I know the committee's heard me say that before, but when we talk about stakeholders and we talk about constituencies and communities, that's an enormous community that we mustn't forget. In terms of some of the community angles within that, Rhoda, the people who participate in sport as members of a club participate more often and for longer. Now, obviously, Charlie was talking about some of the health benefits and related to your question. So the contribution that clubs make from that point of view in terms of physical health, and certainly let's not forget mental health as part of that as well, are quite significant in terms of the frequency and in terms of some of that intensity. And that's not even thinking about the benefits of volunteering, social cohesion, other things that will come as part of being a member of a club. Again, I know the committee will have heard me say before, Convener, but again, apologies. Our own Chief Medical Officer says that the key indicator of life expectancy in this country is how physically fit we are. more than any other indicator. So let's never forget that when we're talking about fitness, when we're talking about how long people will live, the two go absolutely hand in hand, and I think the prevention angle of that is enormous, and so much more can be made of that, and that would certainly be a plea to the committee as we move forward with some of that. One of the questions that came up at a recent cross-party group on sport meeting was posed in saying the active travel lobby has regularly said a proportion of the active travel budget should be spent on, a proportion of the travel budget should be spent on active travel. And there was a question posed at a cross-party group on sport meeting, I think it was one of the ones Nanette was at as well, where they were saying, well, what would that look like if a percentage of the health budget went into sport? How could we make more of those benefits that you mentioned? I think we can achieve an awful lot more if there's more cross-cutting agendas, and I know that's something, again, that quite a number of parties have raised before, but the contribution that sports make is so much more beyond just health, whether it's contributions to education, diversionary activities, people just enjoying themselves and having fun. And I think the opportunity for more cross-agenda working between different committees, between different agencies, between different national bodies is enormous, and certainly something that would make a fundamental difference, and hopefully something that community planning can play a particular role in. And again, more engagement between sport and community planning, I think, would be a key opportunity within that. But fundamentally, before people can participate in community sport, it is where Charlie was coming from. It's around young people being competent and confident. It's around the physical literacy words that I know we use every time, but it's young people getting the basic skills: run, jump, throw, catch and swim. If they can do that from a young age, as Charlie was saying, then people can participate lifelong. There's a huge amount of progress being made on that, but more can still be done. If every young person has an entitlement to be physically literate, then they can do whatever they like in terms of community participation throughout their lives. And if we can get that building block, then every partner can make more of that opportunity.
Any other panel members? Christine and Stuart and John.
Thanks for the question, Rhoda. The Robertson Trust maybe comes from a slightly different angle, as we fund social enterprises and community sports clubs, externally evaluate them, and then try and get the lessons learned and share those. I think, just to add to what Kim was saying, I think another really important area, most of our funding is about support of young people, and probably those who are most inactive, trying to move them towards being active. And the key thing from evaluations that we've picked up, in addition to what Kim's talking about, is relationships. And that if there's somebody within that club or that community sports hub, it's maybe not the sport that's important, it's actually the relationship they have with a youth worker or a coach, and the enthusiasm and what happens within that relationship. So that sort of youth work approach. So one of the projects we're working with is around actually making sure that there are skilled youth workers within the sport environment, so that they can encourage young people who wouldn't necessarily walk through the door, wouldn't be enthusiastic enough about sport just to walk through the door, but actually, if there's a youth worker there to engage with those kids, they'll come in and start doing some sort of activity. It might not even be physical activity. They may come in and do homework clubs or a youth club, but then as they're part of that environment, their confidence grows, and then they begin to take part in physical activity, and it grows from there. So I wouldn't underestimate that angle of it.
Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think there's a couple of interesting issues that come out, just picking up on some of the points that have been made on the original question. I think from a local authority perspective, there's two important considerations. And the first is in terms of that convergence between physical activity, health and well-being, and community sport, is and around the sort of club dimension, the volunteering aspect. And I think Kim and George and Nigel were touching on that, in the sense of the important role that community sports clubs have in building a sense of belonging within communities, and offering opportunities for individuals to volunteer and give something back to their communities and to young people participating. So I think that's important within the overall context of the health and well-being of our communities. From an individual perspective, I think obviously we're aspiring during 2014 to deliver a more active Scotland, and that from an individual participatory perspective, I think tying to the physical activity agenda, where community sport, I think, has a lot to play, is not only in the development of young people, but also in providing opportunities for adult recreational sport as well. And I think we have to dig a little deeper and look at the motivations that lie behind individuals wanting to get active. And I think things like Jog Scotland initiative and a lot of things which are more targeted at the individual recreational participant, rather than perhaps the high-level athletes, are really the way to go to deliver a more active Scotland. So I think those would be the two main considerations from us in terms of developing and delivering local authority services within that context.
One.
Very quickly, the answer for me would be yes. Community sport has got a vital role to play in terms of increasing physical activity and benefiting the health of Scotland. I think the health benefits, social, economic benefits are well rehearsed, so there's no need to go into those. But we do need to increase the levels of physical activity in Scotland, and for many, sport will be their choice of how to engage in activity. For me, and I think it's been touched on, is the ability to have easy, affordable access to a whole range of community sporting options, and for that to be consistent throughout the country. And I think the introduction of the single outcome agreement for physical activity and inequalities, I think, is a very good start in terms of ensuring that local authorities articulate how they will engage with local people, identify local needs and design sporting opportunities accordingly. So I think we're at the beginning of a very good process in terms of developing future services. But in short, the answer is very much yes. Community sport's got a vital part to play. I think we just need to make it affordable and accessible to the population at large.
I think that was useful because it sort of alluded to our starting point at the inquiry, didn't it? You know, the community sport is a good thing, and I think we all think it is a good thing. And but we had a report to try and identify how we, what were the barriers to making that happen. How could we, deliver that better? And we had a look at all of that. So I suppose at this point we need to have some review of the report. I know there's strong feelings about our starting point and what we examined, and I think people have already said it is a big agenda. So if to go forward with this, I think our objective at the end of this session should at least clearly indicate to the committee and try and influence the committee about what are the important bits of this, because clearly that big agenda we can't do it all anyway, and it might be, as some have suggested, encouraging other committees, it might be focusing on the local authority delivery, it might be focusing on community sport rather than elite development, and so now's your chance to have a comment on the actual report, what was right, what was wrong, and point us in the right direction. George, I see your hand up.
I just wonder whether one of the key challenges for us, if we think 10 years hence from now, if I look at it from the point of view of volunteer participation, we've had nearly a 20-year flatline. And all the kind of research is telling us that, including the recent research about the motivations of people to volunteer for Commonwealth Games, it found that 74% of people in Scotland had not been involved in any volunteer activity in the previous 12 months. And that's a consistent message and picture from different sources of research. So if we just carry on with some brilliant work and projects and everything else, and a consensus that it's a good thing and everything else, all that is settled. But if we carry on just doing what we're doing at the moment, I don't see that that's going to change. And my concern would be whether or not that's the same with participation in sport as well. So I think Stuart's point is particularly salutary in looking at what the motivations for people to volunteer are and what people's motivations are to be involved in engagement. I think you're absolutely right in saying things like the jogging and the ramblers. But there's tremendous growth in certain areas that we can learn from. In Denmark, it seems really particularly impressive. To look at that community associational belonging and connections that actually will succeed in engaging our community in volunteer activity and in sport. But I don't think at the moment we don't seem to have the vision and the clarity of what it is it will take to bring about a bit of a step up, a sea change in there.
I would back George in a lot of respects. Whether it's up to us sitting around this table is, where is the vision? What is the vision for 10 years' time about the level of volunteering? What would volunteering in Scotland be like? And what would it be like in sport? I think is a big question. There's quite a few comments from my colleagues around the table about employer-supported volunteering. But that agenda hasn't moved on. We have a programme called Work Out for Sport. It has its challenges, and we're reviewing it at present. But the idea that employers are a sort of separate subset of the community in Scotland possibly isn't the way to look at it, because most of the people who volunteer as employees are parents, or they're active members of their community clubs, or have had volunteering experience already. So if we're going to shift that pattern, we have to do something different, and one of the things would be to have more of a collective vision of what we're trying to do from our perspective in something like employer-led volunteering.
Yes. Nigel, then Charlie, who else? Then yeah, I'll come to the MSPs, but Scott, I think, I'll take first. Gavin.
Thank you. Just picking up a couple of those. The report focused, obviously, and picked up on the legacy out of the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and I don't think we mustn't lose sight of that, but we must also recognise that that's virtually upon us as the Games. The planning's virtually done, and we probably need to be questioning where we see the impact of that Games, the catalytic effect of the Games going over the next 10 years. And certainly if I look in athletics, and we've touched upon clubs already, we've touched upon the capacity challenges that clubs face to actually deliver a legacy. We see athletics clubs and Jog Scotland groups being part of that legacy delivery. They're the environment where young people, where they want to be the next Jess Ennis, Mo Farah, Lindsay Sharp, that's where they're going to get involved in athletics and become involved in athletics for life. In order to make that happen, we needed more volunteers in our clubs so the clubs could actually cope with that capacity increase. They needed to be able to have more coaches, more volunteers. Now, we've tackled that very specifically, but at the most local level, right at the heart of that club. So we've had somebody in clubs deliberately shaking hands of mums and dads and pulling them out of the car. It's the joke that we come out with, that actually what normally happens is mum or dad drive the children to the athletics club, the car slows down, it doesn't quite stop, the back door's open, two children fall out one either side, and mum or dad accelerate off to Tesco's. The challenge actually is this person starts in the car park to actually stop and shake the hands. Now, the other key element that I think touches on some of George's comments and the whole community side of sport to me is that there's research around that says what is the biggest motivation for people to get involved and to stay involved in sport? And actually it's socialising. It isn't actually fitness. It isn't elite performance. It isn't physical activity. It's actually the fact that we like, as human beings, we like to socialise with one another. And sport and physical activity gives us a unique opportunity to socialise. But it only does that if somebody actually makes it happen in the first place. If I drop my children off at a sports club for training and nobody speaks to me, I will go to Tesco's. If I drop my children off at a sports club and somebody shakes my hand and says, "Hi, what's your name? I'm Nigel. Could you come and help? We'd like to come and see." All of a sudden, I'm dragged in. Now, we've had 900 new volunteers into 17 athletics clubs in 18 months with that very, very localised, direct approach. But you've got to make it happen locally. Having a policy is important to make that happen, but it won't make it happen on the ground. You've actually got to have something happening very, very locally. I've got to shake somebody's hand to make it happen. I've got to look them in the eye, and you know what? We've got to have a conversation. The moment that starts, you're halfway there. You can actually start engaging people. And it's exactly the point Christine made around about youth workers, helping young people who perhaps don't feel confident or competent to join a club. Somebody there to help them, but it's about helping them with the socialising as much as it is anything else. And that cuts across all parts of society, all parts of Scotland, on a totally integrated approach. And I'm looking particularly at Gavin when I say that with regards to athletes with disabilities.
John, I'm going to bring in Gavin because I've missed him, and my apologies, and he hasn't had the opportunity. Gavin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, just to echo what Nigel said, I suppose we face some different difficulties in terms of getting athletes and players involved and getting coaches and volunteers involved. And it's the fear factor of working with disabled athletes and players, and we have to overcome that. And part of it is education and training. The inclusion agenda is something that we push very hard. When we conducted our research for our strategic plan recently, when we spoke to partners across the country, very, very few had an understanding of what inclusion actually meant. Very many said, yes, we're working inclusively. And we said, well, how many disabled athletes and players? Oh, we don't have any. Well, for me, that's not inclusion. Just saying you're inclusive isn't the point. So it's that ensuring inclusion happens. And then it's about overcoming the fear factor, and then having somebody, it's what Nigel said there, is having somebody that can be that introduction into a club, into a welcoming environment. And that could be, from our point of view, that could be something that's separate, and it's down to the confidence and the competence of that individual to become involved. Or it could be an inclusive club, and there's a lot of work to be done around ensuring that clubs are open and welcoming and inclusive of athletes with a disability.
Thanks, Calvin. Charlie?
I have a little website called Spotlight on Sport. My old man was an academic, and he always told me I should write everything down, and it's only now I'm retired that I'm trying to do that. So I wrote, immediately the report came out, my own response to the report, and I put it on my little website. In summary, I wasn't that confident that the report will produce anything particularly fantastic going forward, really, which is how you started off. And I think, unless there's a bit more commitment to making something happen, I don't see a lot changing. Recently, I gave a paper at a big conference in Denmark, and I called it Community Sport in Scotland, a Misunderstood Lost Cause, ? And just to summarise, I'll just put the five points. One of them is one that Annick's just raised. Clarifying the purposes of community sport and school sport to reflect community development and whole school curriculum in the case of schools. We need to be clear what the thing's about, and that's why I'm saying it has the potential. And one club can be hugely different from another club. Sometimes it can be a very negative experience for people. So that needs to be done at all levels. Second, measure and investigate participation and governance of sport at community and school sport level. Evidence gathered by independent sports research organisation with more investigative journalism. And on my website, I'm encouraging students and others to get involved in a bit more investigation into what actually happens. Because I'm not sure when sport is vulnerable for the good news stories, you don't really find out what the bad news stories are very often, and in particular in terms of governance. The next one was bringing down the cost of participation in sport for young people. And it is astonishing to me that you go to a country like Denmark and you find 83% of the kids are a member of a sports club. Why do we have our levels of participation, the difference? And interestingly, and I know Duncan's interested in this because he was on a kind of personal level, but I've got an extract of a report here, Study on Volunteering in Danish Sports Clubs, and I'll hand you this at the end, and the clerk, so they can see it if you need it. And it shows the different kinds of volunteer that you need. It's very hard to get, and I'm pleased that athletics is actually trying to do this. It's very hard in a club to get people to take on the role of treasurer, or some of the roles are not exactly exciting. So you're trying to find those sort of people, it becomes quite difficult. Fourth one, consistently develop and support the social capital of sport. In other words, if I had the job I had in West Lothian looking after sport, and I was the similar job in a commune in Denmark, I would be measured differently. I would be measured on what I did to support and enable and empower the community. That's how to be measured on, not how many facilities I've got. And lastly, establish a community sport think tank. And, I think at the moment we tend to go to what we're former athletes all the time. That's become the big thing. Sports people are now becoming celebs. And now it's the celebs are telling us how sport should be run. I'm not always convinced that many of these celebs ever touch base with community sport.
Stuart.
Thanks, Convener. Just to add, and I think going back to your original questioning, the role of this committee in terms of taking forward the recommendations in the report, and I think from a vocal perspective, obviously an understandable emphasis on the legacy agenda, which was touched on previously, and I think from our point of view, I think the importance will be to sustain that attention to a legacy on a long-term basis beyond 2014, and I think that's extremely important, particularly within the current financial climate, which I don't need to tell those around the room about. So I think we need to think about it. Obviously, 2014 being that chance to really celebrate sport, and hopefully we'll have some successes, and maybe Andy Murray will get through to the final of the Australian Open this time round, and going on to Ryder Cup and Commonwealth Games, etc. But we need to capitalise on that, and we need to look at it as a long-term project and not just thinking about it over the next couple of years. And we need to try and use it to sustain levels of investment in sport within the current financial climate. From that perspective, Vocal's been working very hard with COSLA and Solace, the local authority chief executives organisation, to set up a legacy leads network, which is very much looking at the legacy agenda, and a lot of that is focused on the physical activity and community sport aspect. But not only that, there's obviously economic development drivers as well in there. Also need to remember as well that from a local authority perspective, a great deal of the funding for sport is tied up in maintaining and operating facilities. And a lot of what we're interested in, I think, around this committee, the people aspect of sport, the community sport, the club development aspect, that role which is largely undertaken by sports development officers, often that's the easiest thing to sort of reduce finances. It's easier to reduce budget in those types of areas than it is to close facilities, because in many cases it's not politically acceptable to do that. So I think something in the region of around about 90% of local authority funding is on facility provision and operation. So again, we need to not forget that there's an important aspect of our investment in sport, which is about people, and it's about ensuring we have people on the ground that are able to work with clubs and volunteers, as Nigel so illustrated so well, that they actually to shake somebody, turn around, shake somebody in the hand and say, come and get involved in our club. So I think those are things that I think from a Vocal perspective we would like to bear in mind, and as we take the recommendations of the report forward.
I think Scott and then Kim.
Well, in terms of the report, I think we were really pleased that there was an emphasis throughout the report on equalities, and I don't really think that any of the evidence sessions that I watched, there wasn't someone that presented the case for the inclusion of different minority groups in sport. A year on from the report, though, I think progress is mixed in terms of different communities. I think we've seen lots of new relationships with governing bodies of sports. We've seen new organisations established, new working groups established to challenge the discrimination that's faced in sport. But I do think that there is a lot more work to be done in terms of equality groups, and a real focus to be made on equality groups in terms of how they participate in sport in the future. I don't doubt that everybody in this room doesn't recognise that.
Kim.
Thank you, Convener. I think, going back to one of the points George has made around a vision, I think our members would all subscribe to the vision that the National Agency for Sport have around a world-class system at all levels, world-class sporting system at all levels. And I think some of the challenge is working out what something might look like if it was world-class. And, obviously Charlie was representing different examples from different areas, and I think that's part of the strength in finding what a world-class example would be. I think there's been a huge amount of progress in a number of areas since the report came out, and I think that's really positive. I think the focus on clubs that obviously Rhoda was talking about, through the direct investment that Sport Scotland have put in through £10 million, the new investment directly into clubs, the Club Together programme that Nigel was talking about, there are key examples of that are making fundamental differences, and that's a really positive and very welcome change. I think the ask to the committee in relation to that, you're asking the benefits the committee could provide, Convener, is more support about the recognition and the contribution that clubs make. Club sport is the foundation by which sport, for most sports, most people take part in, and that's massive. That's not to say there aren't other ways that people could and should, and that's great, but recognition of the contribution that clubs make is enormous. I'm sure Gavin will come on to talk about the disability inclusion training that is run through Scottish Disability Sport, but that again is a real game changer for the inclusion agenda, for getting people who have barriers, as Christine was talking about potentially, and Scott the same, in being involved. And again, there's more that the committee can do, I think, about trying to promote what is a great programme, wholeheartedly supported amongst our members, but the challenges that I know Gavin will come on to talk about in getting people trained, you know, raising awareness of what you called attitudinal barriers, I think is enormous, and I think there's more. I'll leave that for you, Gavin, but that the committee can do around supporting that work. There's been huge progress in the school estate that I'm sure we're all aware of, the report that Sport Scotland were working on in partnership with local authorities, you know, what access looked like to the school estate. We've got some learning from that, which is great. So how do we share that learning about programming, about the management of facilities and the community engagement in that process? There's learning now that we can move forward with, now that we know what the current state of play is. So again, that's a huge progress. And I know the work that Sport Scotland are doing with the Scottish Futures Trust is massive about learning the lessons for new school builds. So that, again, that's very welcome progress. It's a start, and I take the point, but there's huge progress can be made there. So again, I think the ask to the committee would be about recognising that that is still an enormous opportunity to get people who are currently active, but hopefully people who aren't so active involved, and that is a community opportunity that we can't miss. So there's huge progress there. I think areas where more progress can be made, I mentioned the prevention agenda, I know, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier. Campbell, as we know, all called for a radical shift. I would question, you know, there has been progress. Whether we've seen a radical shift, I think, is a question. We were called to give evidence to the Finance Committee earlier on in last year, actually, and you know, we talked about, you know, where has there been success. You know, look at the examples of the Jog Scotland programme, which has now been in existence for 10 years. The numbers are phenomenal. You could replicate that easily among different types of activities, different types of sports, but it takes that dedicated funding and dedicated expertise that Nigel's talked about to make that difference, and there would be more that we can do with that. But it is about getting the people who aren't currently active. That's the biggest challenge, and that's where programmes like Jog Scotland have had that success. I think the other area where more progress can be made, and I think Morag touched on it as well, is around some of the volunteering legacies. So we've talked about employer-supported volunteering. As a staff of 2, we've not been able to move that forward in the way we would like to, but I think the potential is absolutely enormous. Yes, we've got some small-scale programmes that we're working on with our members where that can be beneficial, but it is about, you know, enabling and empowering people. The empowerment agenda for communities is enormous, but we need to enable people. People who say they don't volunteer is because, firstly, they don't have time, and secondly, because they don't know where to go to find out about these things. There's more that we can do about that, and employer-supported volunteering could play a massive role. This isn't about people getting commercial team-building days by going and painting clubhouses. Yes, we need clubhouses painted, but this is about the events that, you know, Gavin was talking about earlier that he runs, where they're struggling to get people involved on a weekly basis. This is about the junior athletics clubs who run between 3 and 4 in an afternoon. That's somebody, bit of flexible working hours. We can make that happen. This isn't a big deal as I see it, but it would be an enormous legacy, not just for sport, but for our communities and for all aspects. So I think there's more that the committee can do in championing that, Duncan, and looking at how we make a difference there. I think the committee could help us by looking at a longer-term view and commitment towards sport. It's not an easy one. We don't know what things are going to look like beyond 2014. But if we recognise truly the benefits that sport bring, and obviously being the Health and Sport Committee, there's an inevitable synergy there that surely is a massive opportunity. But I think the other thing, and you touched on it earlier as well, Convener, is about advocating and supporting the contribution that sport makes across other areas, across the other committee agendas, across other areas of work. We responded to a consultation on Scottish planning policy, where one of the major queries that we raised was saying, well, actually, the barrier our members talk about in young people taking part in after-school activity is because of travel. It's because the school bus leaves at 4 o'clock. So if your school bus leaves at 4 o'clock and young people can't take part in sport because of travel, then what does that mean? Well, when we're building new school areas and new communities and we're doing new developments, how are we looking at opportunities for young people to walk to work, to walk to school and cycle to school, which is obviously hugely beneficial in its own right, but that's empowering young people to make choices. And that's about planning policy, that's not about sport. But those things come together, Convener, in a way that sport has difficulty in engaging in such a breadth of agenda that the committee with its work, I'm sure, could provide assistance with.
Christine?
I feel slightly inadequate after that response. I was going to keep it much shorter and tighter than that in terms of answering the question about what could the committee focus on. Anyone that knows me even slightly knows that I'm an action-orientated person. I'm not very good at the talking and the going round in circles. So from our point of view, it would be fantastic if people could get together and agree some outcomes that we're looking for from this, and then put together some actions that can then be monitored over time, so that we actually can see some leadership and move forward on that. Obviously involving people, Sport Scotland would need to be at the hub of that. For us, I think increasing community ownership and management of facilities would be a fantastic way forward. I think it was Charlie, you referred to the amount of money that's tied up in the running of facilities. There was a piece of work done in Argyll and Bute a couple of years ago looking at the swimming pools in Argyll and Bute and how much cheaper the community-owned swimming pools were to run than the local authority-owned swimming pools. So there's something in there about handing over facilities to local communities. It's not always the right thing to do. A local community has to have the capacity, the skills, the motivation to want to do it. So we're actually working with the Scottish Government, Social Investment Scotland and Sports Scotland at the moment to look at a programme of building community ownership and management. So that's one area for us. And the other would be around, and it's in the written response I gave for today, around enabling groups to better measure the impact that they have. Just because you deliver sport doesn't mean it's delivering the outcomes that you're looking for, particularly in the community sport, when you're looking for sport to achieve other things like maybe reducing crime, increasing health. Just delivering sport doesn't mean that happens. So actually enabling groups to better measure what they do, better be able to evidence what works and what doesn't work for particular outcomes, I think there's a huge area in that could be done.
Morag and Gavin and Colin asked me ages ago to get in, and so did Bob, so I will get to the MSPs, and I think Dennis did as well, so I will get to them, but you know, our guests this morning are filling the space, so I'm letting them get onto it.
Just back some of what Christine and some of what Kim said, but it's about the culture, it's the ownership at a psychological and community level that's important. Our experience through Positive Coaching Scotland is about using that opportunity to allow a club to review what its role in the community is, what it is set up to do, what it wants to do for its young people. There's some fantastic example out there about, for example, Hillfoot Rugby Club went from almost dying to now being the fastest growing rugby club in the last 3 years because they set out with a small group of parents to decide that they would make sure that everybody could play. And they started earlier as well in terms of the number of young people that they had, and that they don't concentrate on the sport too early. So there's lots of examples there, but that's investing in the human capital. And I don't think we can get away from that. And I think if we had clubs growing at the rate that Hillfoot's has grown over the last 3 years, then we would be in a much better position. And it's a way of that engagement between the parent and the volunteer and the kids working together. The point about employer-supported volunteering, I'll go back to slightly. I think what we've again got to look at is that broader perspective. Clubs need skills. We come from a business perspective, and what we've done in our review has shown that fundraising, governance issues, and probably developing and marketing to get volunteers are the key sort of niches that clubs want that perhaps business can help with. We're quite small, and we're challenged by how we upscale the programme we've got, but we're happy to get rid of the programme we've got because we think there's still work to be done in that area. However, there's also, I believe, through the experience of Sported in Scotland and also some of the investigatory work we've done, is there's a pool of older people who perhaps have those business skills, who are not restricted by being full-time employees, who could become a target of volunteering. Again, we've tried, not very successfully, to try and engage with something like that, but I definitely think, given that involving people once they're retired in something that can regularly contribute in the community will be good for them, without sounding like cod liver oil, that it's something that they can give back, but they have the skills that actually the clubs need, and possibly they wouldn't be bored being a treasurer.
Gavin.
I just want to follow up on the great advert that Kim gave for us in terms of some of the work that we're doing. I think the one real legacy that's left from us from the 2012 Paralympic Games has been the increase in public perceptions of disability and disability sport. And I think we're in a good place just now, and it's reflected in some of the work that we're doing. But there are still some big issues out there. In 2009, we ran a conference around school sport and PE. We had 200 delegates on the floor, and when asked by one of the speakers, not by myself, how prepared they felt to cope with disabled pupils in a mainstream school environment, one hand went up on the floor. to say that they felt prepared. As a result of that, we developed with our sports inclusion model a training package for schools with funding from Sports Scotland and Education Scotland. We've been delivering that in schools. We've had a great response, 98% satisfaction rate to the training. 90% have indicated an impact on their delivery back in schools, which is the most important part from our point of view. So we're seeing results there. Our regional manager structure that we've got in place now, thanks to funding from Sports Scotland, are able to support the schools, so we can start then to direct young pupils into community sports clubs, and we're working with 21 governing bodies of sport at the moment. And I put that down largely to the impact of the Paralympic Games. And we're working with them to ensure inclusive clubs and to ensure coaches and volunteers are educated and prepared to be able to work effectively with disabled pupils. So we're getting there, but what we need are governing bodies that are fully inclusive. We need clubs that are open and welcoming. And what we really need, one of the big things that we need to do, is to ensure that that disability inclusion training is embedded within the curriculum within tertiary education, so that all teachers are coming out prepared, because at the moment we're delivering an in-service and it's only on a voluntary basis. So we need to get into the core, and we need to have that inclusion message absolutely fundamental to everything that's been done.
My heart's melted. John, I was just going to bring in the MSPs there, but John, I'll take you as...
Thank you very much.
Then my heart's melted for Colin. I need to get Colin in.
Right, I'll try and keep it brief. I mean, obviously, as a national advisory and delivery board, we are drawn to point 7 of the recommendations in terms of the development of local authorities producing local sports strategies. As I mentioned earlier, I'd be keen that was expanded to not just include sport, but it was physical activity and in its wider sense, sport being a component of that. I think also we advise that to ensure consistency of delivery and accessibility to services, that would be based on best practice guidance. And clearly the content of that is no great surprise in terms of partnership working, which clearly community planning partners will provide, really maximising SOAs and the community empowerment legislation that will be forthcoming. I mean, obviously placing place at central to all the delivery in terms of safe, accessible environments. I think also in terms of maximising where we work, the school setting, which of course does a lot, and the increasing role of the NHS and care setting in terms of supporting and advising patients and residents and clients how to become more active. I think it would be unwise not to consider the various populations, age, gender in terms of how you design local services and ensure that clearly the workforce is developed and skilled to support across all spectrums of society. I think also is vital, and I think it was picked up in your point, Charlie, in terms of Let's Make Scotland More Active, is really using the knowledge and evidence in terms of how that's applied for future delivery of services. And finally, in terms of communicating, not just communicating the positive message of how to become physically active, but how you can actually access those services and supports at a local level and really maximising new technology. I mean, one of the big challenges now, and it wouldn't have been predicted 10 years ago when Let's Make Scotland More Active was first written, was that in 10 years' time, over 50% of us would be doing our Christmas shopping online. That would have never been predicted. We take things for granted in the past where shopping and walking to work would involve an element of physical activity. That's now been challenged because of online, it's been challenged because of home working, and we have to look at alternatives and what can fill that gap that in the past we took for granted. The good news, I think, at a national level, we are very good at policy, we're very good at developing structures and providing strategies as well. The real trick is how we translate that into local action that meets the needs of local people and is consistently applied across the country.
Sure. Colin.
Thanks, Duncan. Almost forgot what I was going to say. Actually, there's been quite, since I put my hand up, actually, there's been a lot of stuff said that I totally agree with. I think Kim, as usual, comes out with some really interesting points. I think the thing that's always kind of confused me, maybe you can help me out here, but to me, we start speaking in terms of the community involvement in sport, and then we head over to, we hope Andy Murray does really well, and we jump between this community sport and the elitism that comes out in sport. And I've always seen sport it doesn't matter what end you are or where you are. It's a case of how easy is it to access? Can you find a level that you're comfortable at? Whether it's competing, meeting your mates once a week for 5-a-sides, or you're doing 130 miles a week in distance running, something like that. And to actually make it different, to me, has always been confusing because it's one part of the same problem. And it should be looked at. How do you progress through athletics? I've been waiting 30 years to see if Alan Wells's 100, 200 metre record from Moscow have ever been beaten. No, they haven't. 1975 for David Jenkins, 400 metres. My old mates, Graham Williamson, John Robson, Alistair Hutton and Nat Muir still hold Scottish records. We've never seen any improvement in that. There's been a breakdown. And from where you get at the bottom, where people feed off to their own level, to the point where they find, well, I'd like to do a little bit more. Now, I wouldn't say there's any more. You're not going to get many 40-year-olds wanting to take up sprinting, but you might in distance running through the jog initiatives and stuff like that. And it's finding those levels. And at some point in that graph that should head up from base level to international elitism, because tennis is certainly not doing. We've got Andy Murray with a specific way he was brought through the system. I don't see many other kids who have been given that same opportunity. I may be wrong. And certainly I am picking on athletics a bit because I have been particularly critical of that because it's my old sport. You wouldn't think so, but it is. So what I'd really like to know is, and the difficulty is obviously getting into the sport. And the hubs, I have one round the corner from me, and wonderful facilities, but unless you're actually a member of a club, you can't use it. There's a swimming pool that lies empty for quite a lot of the time. Why is that? So it's getting people in, getting their level, and it comes down to the volunteer coaches. How trained are they? How aware are they? And how can you fit the kids in particularly who are coming through, and those people who are maybe my age, a bit more, who just want to find something that they can do without killing themselves, and actually take it through and work that way through the bottom right to elitism. If we can get it, that it's not different for one, different to the other, we might actually have a gradient that can be achievable. My opinion, maybe you can discuss.
Thanks, Colin. Some responses to that, and just remind people we've got about 20 minutes now before we've got our next item, which is the Minister. So Stuart and then Nigel made a bid, and then see Charlie.
Just very quickly, I think the point was absolutely made. I think the point I was trying to make is it's a difficult balance to strike between performance sport and community sport, which is our interest really here today. And I think what we've seen is the importance of, role models, and particularly initiatives like Champions in Schools that are providing a real benefit to our young people by taking people who have a story to tell about how they've achieved success into the classroom, and delivering that really has the potential to inspire people. And I think, regardless of our opinions about tennis or Andy Murray, he's been a real success story, and there are many more that came out of 2012 that have been acting as advocates and role models for young people. So I think that's the point I was trying to make in terms of that role. But there's an argument to say, are they really the important role models? And I would maybe suggest that, alongside that, there are the local coaches and volunteers, the people that are delivering on the ground for our young people, and they, in many ways, are more important role models when I think back to my own experiences of the people that influenced me when I was growing up and the opportunities that I had. So I think there's a balance to strike. There's a role for our performance athletes, and it's important we want to be successful on the international stage, but we also need to not forget about the influence that local people have on the ground, volunteering and working with young people day in and day out.
Nigel.
Just coming back on the athletics side, and I suppose the link between community and elite, I think one of the challenges I've seen in sport in Scotland is we
between as well to find
absolutely, but actually there's a danger not only in athletics. I've seen it in other sports as well in previous roles. We look for champions aged 12, 13, and 14, and there's an ego potentially within clubs with some coaches around about, I've got somebody, they're very special, I'm going to take them all the way. The challenge is the reality, and Morag touched on this about not specialising too earlier on, and I absolutely back that point totally. There's a real danger in putting too much emphasis on early achievers in sport, because there are big physiological advantages, there are big psychological weaknesses that then hit later when smaller, later developers start catching up. So there's a real issue about keeping people involved in a wide range of sport and physical activity. I could refer that to the physical literacy that Kim touched on earlier. There's an undoubted link to quality physical education right the way through primary and secondary school, delivered properly by experts. That's in primary level as well as secondary, by the way. But then not pigeonholing people into one sport or one particular discipline like sprinting or endurance too early, so that actually you can let them come through. Jamaica has a bit of a reputation at the moment for success in sprinting. They talent identify their sprinters at the age of about 17. In Scotland, we're talent identifying sprinters at the age of 12. There's something wrong there. Which country would you back to be successful in sprinting in the Rio Olympics? It's not Scotland, that's for sure. Now, I'm not saying that's the only issue. There are big society issues. There's role modelling. There's all sorts of things around about that as well. We're a very different country to Jamaica. But there is something about how early and the pressures we put upon young people, which in turn drives people away from the sport when they stop succeeding, aged about 15, 16 and 17. And we see that. So there's some big issues wrapped up in that affects coaching. The positive coaching model is a big part of that. A lot of the work we're doing and lots of sports are doing with Sport Scotland in terms of working with clubs. The education of clubs and coaches is absolutely fundamental to that. And there's something we can do about it. But we do have to focus on that and spend a lot of time and effort on it as well.
Charlie?
Try quickly, very quickly. I think I'm very pleased you made the point, really, because I think, personally, we've got an issue now to do with the governance of community sport and the governance of elite sport, because it is, I think I said this before, it's becoming so much from the top down, and it can be missed out. Then we have to bear in mind the huge differences. My own sport is swimming. I'm involved in a big club in Edinburgh called Warrender, but there are other clubs in Edinburgh who will only have the kids training twice a week, and so you have a different view. And then you have whether the older people are involved, and I'm worried about the moment because we've now got a concentration about youth sport, so it's all youth sport, but that doesn't happen by itself. I always regard a good club, a community club, being literally a community club and effectively an extended family, because as Stuart mentioned, that sense of belonging is the big thing. And on the issue of facility access, I think there is a big question to be asked about why our facilities are becoming so expensive for people to use. Now, sometimes, I think we should probably break up some of the facilities so they're run, as you were mentioning, by the community locally, more locally sometimes, rather than have sometimes quite a big bureaucracy to run the facilities. It'd be okay if they were helping the clubs, but they don't always help the clubs, they just run the facilities. So I think that it's the business of clarity, governance. There will be differences. If you take golf, I helped with a review of golf some years ago, Scottish Golf. At that time, the mean age of membership of a golf club in Scotland was 55. Apparently, that is now 60. And that will be largely because, I assume, they've got their own clubhouses. And then it's a bit worrying because, of course, what we learned when we were doing that little bit of work I did at those times was where we're good at looking after the adolescents in golf, the age of the rebel. And some clubs will have to learn how they do that to take it forward. So lots of little aspects, but I think I'm arguing that it's such a big topic, it's such a big thing, that it needs more of a drive, more of a vision of what it could be.
Kim.
Thank you, Convener. I am conscious of your time point. Two quick points from me. One, I think Colin's point was exactly it. They're not different. Community sport and elite sport are part of the same continuum, and certainly the point from our members would be it's not one or the other. They're both really important. They both support each other, and as you say, it's a continuum where people move up towards one or back to the other or whatever point along that. So it's certainly not one or the other. It's definitely both, and they're complementary to each other. And the other one was just picking up on your tennis point. Our colleagues from tennis aren't here today. I suspect what they would say is not many countries have 2 Wimbledon champions, but certainly the impact on that they would note has been a huge increase in their club membership. Now, I don't have the figures with me, and I'm sure they would certainly happily provide those, Convener, if we wanted, but their club membership has grown massively, which I think absolutely echoes your point about that continuum.
Thanks for that. Dennis.
It's a couple of points. Basically, we've heard really a fairly generic approach to some of this, and I want to take up maybe some of the points that Charlie's made and Kim. And really, when we look at community, I really haven't heard much about how we facilitate and resource and set down the pathways for people within sort of rural areas. Because most of our community facilities are within the sort of urban areas. If I take my own constituency, there's nothing within the constituency, but next door there's the sports village in Aberdeen, which is an excellent facility. But someone in Braemar or Huntly or someone like that doesn't have the same access. So we're looking at what's there for that local community, and do we do enough to sort of take the sort of transition from a young person through adolescence to middle age and then the older spectrum in terms of their level of fitness and changing of sports. And it was Kim that mentioned there's a fun element. It doesn't have to be totally competitive. Maybe we're just trying to get through a mindset and an attitudinal change of when we're engaging, it should be. And I think the model that Disability that Sports Scotland has in some respects is a good one and could be actually taken forward and used across the whole spectrum, because it's about inclusion. And I'm just wondering, really, are we being too generic? Do we really need to have the vision that someone else mentioned of having a smaller micromanagement of some of the sports that we have to engage our local communities, right down to the rural and remote?
Have some responses? Stuart, Charlie?
I'll give it a go, convener. Just in particular to the first point about access to rural, access to community facilities in rural areas. It's something that I deal with on a regular basis in my day job with Perth and Kinross Council. Also faces similar challenges to the ones that MSP's outlined. I think it is difficult, and I think that where we need to increasingly look to the role of local school facilities, in particular in rural communities where primary schools, we can improve the quality of primary school provision in local areas and ensure that that is accessible to the community. Travel and transport is going to be an issue, and that's sometimes a choice that individuals make about living in a rural area. There are other advantages to doing that, having access to the hills and other activities and things that people can do. But I think it is a challenge we face, and particularly in some areas in Scotland, but that access to the school estate and improving the quality of provision may be an avenue that we want to explore to do that, and working with Sports Scotland to try and ensure that the quality of provision is adequate and there is access to that provision.
Charlie, and then Nigel. Anyone else?
I was fortunate at the Olympic year to be invited to attend the Olympic Games in Elgol Primary School on the island of Skye. I think there were 14 kids, and it was quite something very, very emotional for me. I think, as Stuart's saying, it has to be use everything we've got, and that's why you need that local thinking. What have you got? My big argument for community sport is the same as it would be for community music. You belong to something, and try and give them some things to belong to in their local community. Hopefully it will reflect the culture. If you're going to be in Skye, you'd probably want to link with the culture of Shinty, for an example, as one of the sports you'd want to be putting there. But to belong and then try and connect with what's in the community. And generally, as I think Kim was referring to, the issue of travel is a real big problem. Really big, even within the city. And the way I used to work in West Lothian, and semi-urban is broadly how I would describe much of West Lothian. And the big issue is, how do you belong? And we tried to make 9 neighbourhoods out of West Lothian, and we tried to plan it on the basis of those 9 neighbourhoods. So I think it does need a lot of thinking at local level to try and give people that opportunity of belonging and expressing themselves.
Nigel, and then Kim, quickly. Yeah.
2 very quick examples in terms of clubs centred in bigger populations can impact rurally. So a club based in Motherwell, Lawn District Athletics Club, with a base also at Carluke, have if you like, an offshoot once a week, operating out of Biggar. Similarly, Central AC in Stirling have offshoots in Callander and Killearn and places like that. Now, they don't cater for all disciplines of the sport, as Colin would be familiar, or all levels of athletics, but they provide a fantastic opportunity, particularly for younger members, to get involved in the sport with mums and dads locally and their own local volunteers there. And then as they progress, there comes a point where they would need to progress to probably more specialist facilities and more specialist coaches and come back into the centre. So kind of outreach centres are a big push we're doing with some of the bigger clubs to cater for those rural areas and keep the opportunities very local up to a certain point.
Kim? And then Christine.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's a really good, really fair point, Dennis, absolutely. I'm conscious the point of travel has been picked up in relation to my earlier point as well, which I think is absolutely important for after-school activities as much as anything else. I think one of the key parts in terms of the rural areas is recognising how much outdoor activity and outdoor sports and adventurous activity sports take place within the rural areas. I don't have figures certainly on it, but I know the contribution to be hugely significant. Contributions towards tourism and income generation in rural areas is massive from the contribution that sport makes, and I think that we certainly can't forget that. But the wild landscape that we have in Scotland is certainly something that we're massively envied for. The outdoor access legislation that we have is world leading, and again that means that people hopefully within rural communities, but hopefully it also brings people from more urban communities into more rural communities. So I think the opportunities that provides, the landscape and the rural aspect, are significant for participation in sport. I grant it's a slightly different response to your question, but I think it's a really important point that we can't forget.
Christine.
Funder of community-led projects, I think it's probably worth saying we get more applications from communities in rural areas than we do from urban areas for sports facilities. I think there tends to be more of a tradition of community needing to do things for themselves because there isn't that tradition of maybe local authorities doing it so much. So just 3 examples that came into my head that we've had recently: Tongue and Far, which is probably about as far north and remote as you can get in the north of Scotland, New Deer, and also Duns in the Scottish borders. So 3 examples of really strong communities developing sports facilities for all ages, a variety of sports. I think that's the other thing, multi-sports rather than just single sport, which gives people opportunities to engage in all sorts of ways.
John?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think in terms of the whole theme of rural living, affordability and a family focus, I think no doubt it's been mentioned at previous committees, but clearly the High Life model is an example where it is affordable to a whole range of different resources throughout the Highland Council area. I mean, £26 per month per family for access to all resources, I think, is a fantastic offer, with 50 pence only for activity for people in low income. So I think that in itself is an example of focusing on the family and it being an affordable option for many. I think also in terms of local resources being available, what is available are primary and secondary schools. And again, just building on the school estate audit that Sport Scotland completed, I think again it's been recognised there's a lot more opportunity that can be gained in terms of accessing the facilities. I mean, the report did say that 329 schools, 98% of the facilities were available for use. However, during the school holidays, only 43% and 20% of outdoor facilities were actually used themselves. So I think there's potential there to really maximise the use of schools within rural settings and the resources that are available for them.
Just got a few minutes before we need to break up. Is there anybody else want to ask a quick question? Just if no one, just to follow on that, I mean, I think we also focused as a committee about where the facility is there, the facility is free, and it's on the edge of a deprived neighbourhood, and we're not reaching those people. I think those hard-to-reach young people from deprived communities and young girls and women, you know, the barrier isn't necessarily cost. The facility is in the heart of the community. Whose job is it to get these people? I mean, we're all in the game of numbers and demonstrating numbers and application for grant, and we can do this and we can deliver this. Whose job is it to get those people who are not participating? Are we, you know, does it go back to the scrutiny question, Charlie? Does it, you know, do we really understand who is participating and who's participating in 3 clubs? But who's doing the job of getting those young people that we need to get in to sport for all sorts of important reasons. Stuart?
I don't think it's any one particular group or profession. I think it's a mix, and I think I come back to the point I made earlier, convener, about the importance of having the right people on the ground doing the right job and engaging with those hard-to-reach groups. I think with that particular group that you're referring to within more deprived communities, I think it's a much more real challenge, and I think there are people with youth work and social work skills that are excellent at engaging with young people, but perhaps don't have the knowledge and understanding or ability to deliver sporting activities. At the same point, we've got very well qualified coaches, volunteers and leaders within communities, clubs and local authorities who are perhaps able to deliver the sporting aspect but don't have the softer skills about trying to engage with that particular target group. And I think the challenge is trying to bring those two skill sets together and either upskilling our social work colleagues, our community development colleagues, our youth work colleagues to be able to deliver sporting activities, and equally upskilling our sports coaches to be able to engage more effectively with harder to reach groups. And alongside that, there's the work of the third sector and a lot of our street work projects and many organisations who actually exist and do deliver activities targeting those groups and have been very successful in doing so, UK-wide organisations like Street Games, for example. So I think there's lots of ways. It's not any one particular group. It's I think it's a bringing together of different skill sets.
Is it delivering better outcomes? Are we getting greater levels of participation? More, and Christine?
Example of the work that we're doing with North Glasgow Homes. We're working with the Housing Association and have set up a 2014 legacy project which was to introduce sport to the areas in North Glasgow, particularly Postle Park. That's been about a connecting role for the post that we've put in place between the sort of workers that Stuart was just describing. But the example specifically around swimming and the free access to swimming, and the fact is that there's a generational thing here of generations now who can't swim. So the parents can't swim. So of course it's very difficult for you to encourage the young people to swim because there's no one. So we've gone in and started training the parents to swim, and then some of them to be swim teachers, and that's with Scottish Swimming programmes as well. And the same happened with the bike skills as well. The kids were just not ready for what was actually perceived as free, easy, accessible provision, because they either didn't have bikes or they had no confidence whatsoever to start. So you have to go to where people are beginning and build up slowly. And again, it's going to take a couple of years before hopefully that shows some fruition.
Christine?
Just to agree with Stuart about the need for the link between youth workers and sports coaches, we're funding a programme led by Scottish Sports Futures. It's another legacy programme called Active East in the east of Glasgow, and that's exactly what it's doing. It's bringing together sports clubs with local youth organisations to transfer skills and people, I suppose, developing a network of local young leaders who are then working with the younger people within their communities to bring them on. And there's the project's being externally evaluated by the University of Stirling, but already seeing an increase in participation numbers, increase in young people volunteering and what they're able to do for that. And there's also Scottish Sports Futures are now looking at establishing an academy for young people within the Emirates Arena in the east of Glasgow to build on that and again leave a lasting legacy. So there are examples of good practice and that are making a difference, and it's some of the challenges is sharing that and where that information goes and how others can learn from that.
George?
A link to the likes of Race for Life and Moonwalk and Children in Need, just to put that in as well, that things like that have been highly participatory, filled with fun, filled with I'm raising cash for a family member that suffered cancer. No, there's lessons there too about how we can relate to a wider audience that don't normally participate in the normal offer, but will participate in things like that. My mind's drawn as well to Graham Aubrey and a wonderful cyclathon or whatever it was in Glasgow, and massive numbers of people involved in that in cycling too. So I think we can learn lessons from them.
Can I thank you all for your attendance here this morning? I know it's been wide-ranging, as some of our previous work, but I think we are, as a committee, we fully recognise that we are the Health and Sport Committee. and we are more than willing and happy. Gil's just arrived, and Gil was one of the members that was pushing us to do some work on sport, and we've begun that work, and we are more than happy to work with you to develop our focus as a committee. And indeed, I think some of the points that you've made about working with other committees to get them to realise the importance of sport and participation and the impacts on health and well-being. So, this is a process that we are involved in, and we're happy to work with you to get that greater focus, either looking at short pieces of work and evidence sessions that focus on one particular subject to see if we can make some progress there. But it's work that will take place over the next couple of years and the remaining time of the committee. But we appreciate once again your attendance here this morning and the way you've participated, and we thank you very much for being here. Thank you. We'll temporarily close at this time till we set up for the next item on the agenda. Thank you all. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is to consider a legislative consent memorandum from the Scottish Government in relation to the UK Children and Families Bill. In your papers, you will find the Scottish Government memorandum, a draft motion and an explanation of the LCM procedure. This morning we have an opportunity to question the Minister for Public Health on the LCM before deciding whether we wish to recommend to the Parliament that the LCM be approved. And can I now welcome Michael Matheson, Minister for Public Health, Kenneth Tetkin, who is the Senior Principal Legal Officer, Scottish Government. Good to have you here. And Siobhan Mackay, Tobacco Control Advisor of the Public Health Division. Welcome to you all. Can I invite the Minister to make an opening statement, please?
Thank you, Convener. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the draft LCM on the regulation of tobacco retail packaging. This relates to an amendment by the UK Government on the 16th of December to the UK Children and Families Bill. The amendment, which extends to Scotland, provides for powers to make regulations on tobacco retail packaging in order to reduce the risk of harm and promote health. The Children and Health Bill will return to the House of Commons early in February 2014. Members will be aware that those amendments were laid with very little notice given the significance of the issue. This meant both the Scottish Government and this Parliament have had little time to consider the detail of the proposals. I wrote to the UK Health Minister, Jane Ellison, to make clear my frustration at this. However, I believe this is an important public health matter to which the Scottish Government is committed and will make a real impact on Scotland's health. Scotland is rightly recognised as a world leader on tobacco control. Our latest strategy, Creating a Tobacco-Free Generation, which was published last year, set out our bold vision of a tobacco-free Scotland by 2034. A key measure contained in the strategy was the introduction of standardised packaging for tobacco products. This followed a joint UK-wide consultation on tobacco packaging in 2012. I gave careful consideration to the consultation responses and all of the relevant evidence on standardised packaging. I'm clear that standardised packaging of tobacco products would reduce the attractiveness of tobacco products, increase the effectiveness of the health warnings, and remove design techniques which may mislead consumers about the harmfulness of tobacco products. In particular, evidence has shown the measures to be most effective amongst young people. Our tobacco strategy set out that we would wait the decision of the UK Government and other devolved administrations before setting out a way forward on standardised packaging for tobacco. Following a disappointing announcement from the UK Government that it would not proceed with standardised packaging but would instead await further evidence before deciding on legislation, our programme for government set out the Scottish Government's intention to bring forward a bill on tobacco packaging in 2014-15. Since then, the UK Government has changed its position and has decided to introduce enabling powers to regulate tobacco retail packaging, which once again opens up the potential for us to work with the UK Government on this important matter. I welcome the UK Government has followed Scotland's lead in this particular matter. It's my view that there is merit in the Scottish Government working actively with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to deliver regulations which could come into force at the same time. Because this measure concerns the protection of public health, this is a matter of devolved competence, and the legislative consent motion before the Scottish Parliament is required in order for the UK Secretary of State to make regulations on tobacco retail packaging in Scotland. The UK Government's decision to make regulations will be subject to further review of evidence, which is due to report in March of this year. In developing regulations, I've been clear that the UK Government must work closely with the Scottish Government. This is reflected in the UK Government's amendment and the high degree of official cooperation that has been put in place. Should the UK Government decide not to proceed with regulations or to delay or to water down proposals, the Scottish Government would, of course, continue to proceed with legislation through the Scottish Parliament. I'm hopeful that in its latest review of evidence, the UK Government will agree that there is strong evidence to show that regulating tobacco retail packaging will help protect the health of future generations of young people from the harm of tobacco use. And I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Minister, for that opening statement. Any questions from the members? Rhoda Grant.
Just clarity on the position. You said in your opening statement that if the UK Government don't legislate, don't use the powers under that this LCM are given them, that you would still be able to legislate separately. Would that mean, could you use the powers for subordinate legislation in this Act, or would you need to put forward primary legislation in Scotland to legislate?
Well, I'm hopeful that after the UK Government have conducted their own review of evidence again, and it's reported in March, that they'll be content that there is a sufficient degree of evidence to support the introduction of standardised packaging. Should they choose not to proceed with the introduction of regulations in March, or should they seek to water them down or vary them in a way which we do not believe is beneficial in trying to achieve the public health benefit that we believe can come from this, then we will be required to take forward our own piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament. And what I've arranged is for our officials to continue to undertake the work that's necessary to set out our consultation that would be necessary before the bill, so that work continues, so that should there be any change come the review in being reported in March, that we are in a position where we can respond to that should we need to take forward our own legislation.
Just a final question. On the process, this is obviously enabling legislation for secondary legislation. When the secondary legislation comes forward in the Westminster Parliament, will we have a further LCM to this Parliament to review that legislation?
I've given a very tight timescale around this issue, which emerged just before the Christmas recess. There was a need for us to act quickly and to respond to the UK Government's position on this matter. I put to the UK Government that I think it would be helpful if the regulations which will apply in Scotland were to come before the Scottish Parliament, so that the Parliament has an opportunity to scrutinise those regulations. And it would be helpful if we could come to an agreement which would allow us to do that while using the UK bill in order to achieve the introduction of the regulations. I'm still waiting for a response from the UK Government on that matter. So it may be possible, but given the limited time frame that they have within the House of Commons around the bill presently being in the House of Lords and then being reported on at the end of January and then going into the House of Commons, they have a very compressed time frame. So it may not be possible, but I have put to the UK Government that would be my preferred position. But it may be that we will not be in a position where we can bring the regulation before the Scottish Parliament. What I can give you an assurance of is that the amendments are drafted in such a way that Scottish Government has to be fully involved in the drafting of those regulations and to be engaged in that process.
You mentioned that I presume you're concerned that it may be watered down from the Scottish Government's expectation. What discussions have you had with UK ministers that bring forward that concern?
Well, we were of the view that following the joint consultation which we had last year, which ran from April to August on the issue of standardised packaging, we were convinced, given the evidence base that accompanied that consultation and also the responses which we received, that there was a very strong case for moving forward with standardised packaging. And I was very much of the view that the UK government would arrive at that view as well. That transpired not to be the case for their own reasons, hence why, as I mentioned, we were going to set out that we would take forward the policy ourselves. Given the very limited time frame we've had since the UK government have indicated the possibility of these amendments, I want to be assured that once they have completed this further review, which they feel is necessary from their perspective, that we get regulations that are as strong as possible in the introduction of standardised packaging. But I've made it very clear to them that we reserve our right that should we think that the regulations that they eventually bring forward are not sufficiently strong, then we might then seek to bring forward, we will then seek to bring forward our own legislation.
What gives you that precise concern? What advice have you had from your officials that there is a real concern here? Because you've used a very pejorative phrase that these proposals may be watered down.
Well, it's on the basis that if they should...
Give me 2 or 3 examples of what gives you that concern.
Let me give you a practical example of a piece of policy that we pursued previously around the Primary Medical Services Act, which was the introduction of the tobacco display ban within shops. We moved forward on that initially. The UK government then chose to follow that approach as well around the display ban. The way that display ban was introduced in Scotland is in a different way from that in the other rest of the UK. So, for example, the door sizes which are allowed to be used are very, very different. So you can see tobacco much more readily in other parts of the UK than you can here in Scotland. The reason we took that different approach is because we thought that to make the door openings larger compromised the policy intentions of the legislation. And the UK government chose to take a very different approach, and they thought it was too restrictive, so they wanted to lessen the impact it would have on retailers for practical purposes. We chose not to go down that route because we thought it compromised the policy intention. So what I don't want to... I'm just giving you that as a practical example of a defensive approach that we've taken already in this particular issue. What we have to wait to see is what's actually in the actual draft regulations to see whether they meet sufficiently our view. So, for example, there's nothing around being able to have something in the tobacco packets that can be used for promotion work. There's no compromise around any other packaging that comes around the tobacco that comes into the shops and could be there for multi-pack deals. None of these areas are compromised on. So we have taken different approaches to this previously on tobacco control matters. So given the history of that, I think it's only right that we should reserve our position until we've got the draft regulations on whether we choose to take a different approach.
I mean, I would fully expect the Scottish Government to wait and see what comes through the process. But it was just the watered down was just for emphasis. It wasn't.
Yes.
Right, thanks. But you are. I mean, you're asking the committee to support this today, and I presume because the principle is that we will get to the Scottish Government's objective far quicker than we could do it on our own. I think in the recent session with Cabinet Secretary, he was saying that the time frame that we were working to was up to 18 months. So compare our 18 months to what this offers in terms of what the Scottish Government and many of us round about the table believe that there is strong evidence here to pursue that. You know, how will that affect that 18-month time frame? How much sooner will we be able to see this legislation in place if we pursue this course?
Okay, so if we go from the report which the UK Government has requested on a review of evidence is due to report in March of this year. My view is that we should be in a position very quickly after that to have the draft regulations. There will obviously then be a level of consultation with specific stakeholders on that. There isn't a general consultation on them, but there's a specific engagement with the interested parties. There will then, once the regulations have been agreed, there will then it's notifiable under the European Technical Services Regulations, for which there is a 3-month standstill If there's any European country it makes a note of interest in the matter, then it can be a 6-month standstill. So my view is that we can move in this, we can potentially move in this within this calendar year. The issue will be is about whether the UK government agree with that type of time frame. I want to see it happening sooner rather than later. I would hope they would be in that position as well. Out with the technical aspects, we potentially could be in a position where the issue is then been taken forward in this calendar year.
8 months off of this process then, at least.
It could potentially be quicker, pending any external challenges to it itself, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. Is that Gil Patterson? Sorry.
Sort of you
and
posed,
Dennis.
Can I take the opportunity to apologise to the committee for being late? It's a kind of family problem that we had. So I'm sorry for coming in late, particularly on the sports issue. But it's a follow-up to your own questioning, Convener, and maybe I look at it slightly different in a different way. I personally think it's a weakness for governments and political parties not to change their mind. I always think it's a mistake when people, because they've made a statement, they think it's wrong to change that. So I welcome this change of heart. I just hope it's real, like you do, Minister. But I wondered if, I think there's a cross-party consensus in Scotland that what's proposed by the Scottish Government and by the sounds that the Westminster Government is a good thing. What would happen if we do go down this route and Westminster changes its mind, or the Westminster Government changes its mind again? Would that put in jeopardy any action in Scotland? Would we have enough time to complete this in the term of the lifetime of this Parliament?
Well, what we're doing just now is that we're fully engaged with the UK Government on taking forward the regulations that will be necessary to accompany this bill, and the amendments that have been laid by the UK Government place a requirement on the UK Government to consult us on that process. So that work is already starting, although the legislation is still going through the House of Commons process. What I've instructed my officials to do is to continue the work that we were taking forward around taking forward our own legislation within the Scottish Parliament. The next stage of that was to have our public consultation on draft legislation. That work continues. Should we get to March, where we're getting to this final point of the regulations and looking at the detail around the regulations, and there's any view from our point of view that we have to move forward with our own legislation, we're in a position where we've already continued that work and we can just continue that through, and we'll be able to bring forward legislation within the time frame that we've already set out within the programme for government. So it won't compromise our time frame.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, thanks, Minister.
Nanette.
I share the Minister's concern about the short timescale for us to discuss this. We are aware that our stated position is, our position right now is that we wish to wait and see the report of the independent review before we take a final policy position on the issue. So, I mean, we at this stage be happy to support the LCM, but reserving our position on policy until after we have heard the outcome of that review.
Okay. Dennis.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, good morning. Are you aware, is there any indicators at all of how much cross-party support there is in Westminster for this bill?
I think there is cross-party support. Some of you who follow this particular policy issue may be aware that there was some surprise when the UK Government took the position they did. I think it was in August of last year, at the end of the consultation, August, September. Given the nature of the consultation and the evidence that had been submitted alongside the consultation, I think part of the time frame around some of these amendments have come about because of cross-party support within the House of Lords on the measure, which the UK Government have had to respond to. And as a result of having to respond to that, they've sought to bring forward their own amendments in this way. So I think it would be fair to say that there's been a level of cross-party support within the House of Lords that has, to some degree, pushed this agenda on in a way which I don't think the UK government were anticipating.
No other questions from committee members? Thank you, Minister. I don't know where you believe that you need to make any other remarks. Thank you for that, Minister. Therefore, I put the question, which is the committee agreed to recommend to the Parliament that the legislative consent motion on UK Children and Families Bill be approved? Agreed, thank you. That is agreed. Thank the Minister and his team for the attendance this morning and participation. Thank you. That concludes the public part of the committee, and we now, as previously agreed, go into private session. Thank you.